Go. All right, everybody. Welcome to today's edition of Psychedelically Speaking. Um, I'm really excited because today we have Richard Doyle here. He's written books on psychedelics like The Genesis of Now and Darwin's Pharmacy, and I know he's working on some forthcoming projects that maybe Richard you can mention because I know I'm excited for those. Um, and I believe I will drop the basically talk description in the chat, but I think I'm actually gonna just hand the floor over and then maybe at the end say a few quick things about SAPS and what we have going on. So I'm gonna turn the floor over to you, Richard, and then mention a few things at the end.
Beautiful. You can hear me okay, Nathan? Perfect.
Yes.
Look, I really want to thank you for creating the conditions for this discussion. I mean, this is really how knowledge thrives is, small groups of people form unlikely coalitions and meet up and discuss things and misunderstand each other in creative ways. So I'm really looking forward to today's session. This is the kind of thing that I really live for because I know that like changes in discourses happen like at the margins with like uh interesting moments such as this. So I'm looking forward to sharing with whoever shows up from my unlimited perspective. I also wanted to sort of celebrate, so I'm celebrating that. Good job, Nathan and crew for just putting this together. This is an important thing. There's a noble lineage of the psychedelic salon, which I've been lucky enough to dip into here and there. And I think it's a really interesting part of how the knowledge commons of psychedelics gets composed, right? Psychedelic science and more specifically psychonautical practice is really a big player in the early internet and Usenet groups and so forth, where people like Bob Wallace was starting the ProMind Foundation way back in the day and using the early internet as a method for sharing information for the advancement of psychonautical studies. As it happens, I was gifted with the possibility of going down to Peru and drinking ayahuasca in 2002 as part of a research project, precisely because Bob Wallace, who was one of the Microsoft 7, and I think the first to drop out, he marketed the first commercial word processing software, Xyrite, but devoted the rest of his life to sharing factual and experiential information about psychedelics online, so that this new medium really became very psychedelic, like like was psychedelic from the beginning, is essentially going to be one of the arguments that I put forward, which is probably not novel, but I think worth remembering. Um, and you know, this kind of investigation then like really hinges on that word psychonautical, because that was the approach that Bob Wallace really kind of seemed explicitly took. It was really a systems thinking, information thinking approach to thinking about psychedelic experience in the wake of cybernetics, but also the software design that he was doing. And so therefore, you know, tonight's discussion, what I'm happy to discuss with you, focuses, on the set and setting for set and setting, meaning that people like Bob Wallace were understanding very early on from this systems and informational point of view that it was the set and setting for psychedelics that was the place where all the action was happening, right? And that um, people from, including the great chemist Sasha Shulgin, would come to concur with this position that even as he was beautifully exploring experientially with his group, which I think is important to remember, that this was a group project to kind of open source psychedelia that Sasha and Anne Shulgin were hosting here with their group. Um, that in this group, that this that A, if I remember my, Sasha Shulgin correctly, the structure function connection was insufficient to really describe psychedelic experience, that you couldn't get to why something was creating what he would call a plus four, at which point, if I remember correctly, all evolution would stop if all beings were experiencing the plus four. I think I would beg to differ and think more research is needed, but I think that that was his description of the plus four. And so he came to the conclusion that, and again, I'm happy to be corrected by the knowledge commons here, um, that it was really set and setting, of course, first pioneered as a terminology by Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, later Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner, where they very quickly realized that even though this was very much that LSD and psilocybin were very much a kind of biochemical revolution, that this was a harbinger of a new biochemical model of mind that has yielded the antidepressants, etc., the serotonin agonists, but that again, the action was, if you will, at Millbrook. The action was at the edge of the experience where what Leary characterized as the programming of psychedelic experience, his language, um, was really where, to use the venture capitalist terminology, the value added was to be found, right? In other words, that all props to Owsley, all props to Nick Sand, right? And, we have to mark the fact that people like this were incarcerated and, suffered under a prohibition. But all props to them, but that the consensus really seemed to be, and again, happy to hear alternative points of view, that set and setting was where the psychedelic rubber met the road, if you will, right? That if you really wanted to work with psilocybin, LSD for Leary, and then DMT, he talked about programming DMT experience and developed some technologies for recording his responses to those that were really interesting and sort of harbingers of Silicon Valley in certain ways. That set and setting, in other words, the gentle art of creating the contexts under which the best kind of psychedelic experiences can unfold, is really where it's at. And I bring this up knowing full well that all of you probably know all of this full well, but that pointing out that maybe there is this historical moment right now where the medicalization of psychedelics has kind of hit some sort of a plateau or apex as a model, like it's maybe a little bit stalled as a market and a brand. And that part of that, is about, the attempt to commodify the experience and the, I think, rather constricted understanding of set and setting. And again, happy to be corrected. I'm sure there's interesting things happening out there, but which gets represented by that commodified kind of often one size fits all kind of model for set and setting, meaning that you're limiting liability. The dominant motif in set and setting is the limitation of liability. It like that. It's like the rest of contemporary university, at least in the United States, that I can speak for. That really liability limitation eclipses even contemporary politics as the primary vector of how universities function. So that's why tonight I thought, oh, this is a cool moment then to remind ourselves, say, who are the masters of set and setting? Like how can we raid the past in order to create contexts that are the most conducive to psychedelic, what I sometimes like to call ecodelic healing. And I call it that because I have to shout it like somebody from the rooftops that as a result of that opportunity to go to Peru in 2002, I mean, I just really was unmistakably, indubitably, irreversibly giving thanks to universe healed of atopy, essentially, whose twin heads were asthma and whole body eczema, both caused by a common genetic tradition, which condition, I like tradition as a pun there, because that's how it got treated. It got like in the experience in my second opportunity to drink ayahuasca, uh, I you know sent the asthma stranger on a trip, and the self that was formerly me just was not anymore. And ego death might be one language for that, but it's also just the shedding of a particular quality of self which was left behind and mourned even by the shaman that I was blessed to work with, Norma Pandoro. Like, she wept in its departure. So I speak out of that experience from a humble perspective of really not claiming any special knowledge here, only narrating experiences that have unmistakably worked in my own context, and therefore just like offering them for what they are. So therefore I became, because I realized out of that experience, a healing that continues to this day, uh, the absolute sophistication of the set and setting management and, for lack of a better word, techniques of the sacred that Norma Pandoro was transmitting in our practice with me and in my study with her, that she was, in short, playing the ecodelic experience of ayahuasca like a beautiful multidimensional musical instrument, and that she was such an adept of managing these spaces that I was in awe of it, as like I would be in awe of like a Miles Davis album, uh, in terms of the level of its sophistication. I awoke after the first night of ayahuasca just gobsmacked with the sophistication of it as a technology, that I had experienced the interaction with the contents of my own mind in a way that allowed for extraordinary lucidity not possible in ordinary experience. And I grew to understand through Norma the ways in which that set and setting were really like co-partners with the plant spirit of ayahuasca. And I use the language of plant spirit again intentionally within the context of set and setting, as understanding that set and setting is at least as sensitive as placebo, right? The most wonderful drug in the world that nobody can patent and doesn't cost anything if you treat it right. Um, and that therefore that it seems to be the case for many participants who get the most healing experiences out of these contexts, that this language of plant spirits, or in my own case, the language of plant intelligence, is also kind of instructive, useful, illuminating, right? Not treated as with any ontological certainty beyond what is necessary to the conduct of just everyday life. Um, so in exploring that sophistication of set and setting, of course, which I've now been doing for like 23 years, I finally smacked myself on the forehead and realized that despite my earlier antipathy to the Grateful Dead, that the Grateful Dead were in fact like master adepts of set and setting, and just like, duh, Professor Doyle, right? That here's the, band starts out as the Warlocks with the acid tests and in Palo Alto, and put Gregory Bateson into that same scene. Obviously, Ken Kesey, the spiritual teacher, Adi Da, Allen Ginsberg is at Gregory Bateson's LSD trials there. There's a whole crucible of post-war American culture that is moving through there, and part of it goes through the Grateful Dead in the form of not only Owsley, the soundman and chemist, but in terms of the evolving capacity of the dead to create a psychedelic culture that was able to persist on through a prohibition that was incarcerating the aforementioned Nick Sand, and which functioned, in fact, as an underground, above ground, hidden in plain sight, purloined medicine distribution network for an already existing psychedelia that had already learned about the immense capacities of these of these plants and compounds properly tuned through set and setting to carry out all kinds of audacious healing, right? Uh, and this knowledge is now starting to disappear a little bit. It was lore that I heard growing up in the 1970s, right? About psychedelics not as recreational only, but as obviously what we now consider to be medicine. And so that news was not lost on an often caricatured counterculture psychedelic generation that, frankly, we could still learn a great deal from, right? That you have vast archives of collective experience of working on set and setting, what worked and what didn't. The aforementioned Ginsberg introduces some of the techniques of the curanderas in Pucallpa, Peru, when he visits Leary's lab in the 1960s after they eat psilocybin together. So there's already that percolation that's happening. I think in the case of Ginsberg, it's not fair to call it a colonization, but more like a poet's appropriation. So I just want to throw the dead out there as a current project that I'm working on right now, as trying to simply appreciate what is their architecture of set and setting, what is, what are the various functions, and the lens that I'm looking at it through sets up our second talking point, which is the King James Bible, because second only to the American Songbook for the Grateful Dead, in their terms of their improvisational, what we might call midrash, spiritual midrash, where they're creating an improvisational spiritual practice that is never the same twice, right? Um, so therefore, it resists some of the static qualities of the religions of the book that otherwise can inhere in these monotheistic religions, and instead kind of are able to incorporate, as some dead scholars have pointed out, both the sort of Dionysian qualities that Nietzsche located, but also the Apollonian qualities, the structures within which the improvisational joy and freedom takes place with the dead. And it's that dyad between the structure and improvisation that I would suggest should be one of our kind of key guidances for how do we build set and setting now for the kind of proliferating medicalized psilocybin, for example, which people can grow in their closet or attempt to wait through various kind of legitimate outlets, of which there are an increasing number. But in either case, they're going to have to take responsibility for their own set and setting, because, as the great Terence McKenna once put it, if you don't make a plan, someone else will make that plan for you. And so I think part of doing our due diligence as scholars and practitioners and people who have been healed by these is to just get the information out there that most important thing you can do to get something out of a psychedelic experience is to work on this set and setting angle. Now, how do I work on the set and setting angle? Well, you can study what the Grateful Dead have done. Okay, so you can queue up Live Dead and you can listen to all four sides. Um, and you can notice that there's a kind of openness to improvisation, and also an openness to feedback and recursion. And in that feedback and recursion, there's a play with the Bible, which is then the other kind of hidden in plain sight, I want to suggest beautiful treasure for set and setting in the present moment, which is the King James Bible. Why the King James? Well, because it has this archaic language that we have to stumble over and has a poetic cadence to it, which is well familiar to shamans and poets of many stripes. It's kind of now well known that in Jamaica, when the King James Version was translated finally into the Creole, the patois of the people of Jamaica, many of the Rastafarian poets eschewed it and wanted the cadences of the KJV, even though it was in their slave language of English, right? Because so gifted did they feel by those cadences, right, that they felt like it was more than a worthy bargain. And I think there's really something to that, and it helps explain to us why is the King James Bible the second biggest source for the Grateful Dead, which I'm already suggesting are these, I think worth looking at as masters of set and setting. If we want to create healing psychedelic experiences in the present moment, we can raid the archive of the past and look and see what some of these techniques are. Now, part two here in the chat is called New Shit Has Come to Light, because it's cueing the fact that while it's very interesting that the dead are appropriating and improvising and remixing the King James version of the Bible in their text, in their lyrics, and in their musicianship, it's also the case that the King James was, and the Bible in general, was always already psychedelic. And let me explain that. First of all, as I've argued in another text that I'm happy to share the PDF with anybody interested, that worked with slowly and with a simple amount of deliberation, the languages and the language and cadences of the KJV are themselves highly conducive to the kind of shamanic experience that can also be induced by Gregorian chants, binaural beats, other kind of experiments with chanting and sound. And it's a particularly fertile location for that, which I would suggest, just in a short talk, is one of the reasons why the dead are appropriating so much KGV into their construction of set and setting, because the stuff works. Okay, like it's conducive to the creation of a non-dual state, which is highly conducive to the navigation of a psychedelic experience. Right, Leary and uh, Alpert and all go to Tibet and study with Lama Govinda and raid the Tibetan Book of the Dead because they're like, aha, look, this text helps us navigate the weirdness of psychedelic experience, for lack of a better term. But the KJV is also always hidden there in plain sight. And there's a way in which it's a kind of ambient software for psychedelic experience. Now, why am I saying it's always already psychedelic? Because the New Shit Come to Light reference to the Big Lebowski, of course, is also referencing recent work, archaeological work, which has found, the resins of cannabis and dung in a temple originally built by Solomon from the 5th century BC. And what is interesting about this is A, the sound of crickets that has greeted this news, as far as I've been able to tell, in the kind of religious studies community, where people kind of don't want to touch it because they don't want to make it seem like, somebody found a bong in King Solomon's closet, right? But I think that silence tells us a lot about our wrong view of what spiritual practice and experience is, a view that is dominated by its institutional perspective, that is often scandalized and, of course, represses, burns, creates inquisitions in order to hunt down and root out these forms of non-duality, which have, in Christendom at least, led to the demise of many, right? So I can point everyone to the late Jonathan Ott's great work on the pharmacratic Inquisition, where he details in beautiful manner this treatment. So the new shit has come to light is that if you work closely with the Bible in its aforementioned cadences and in its form as reappropriated by the Grateful Dead, you'll see that there's nothing surprising about the fact that people who were passing on these narratives and these traditions that themselves textually properly practiced can induce something like a psychedelic state. Like here, I'll open a parentheses and point to another remarkable kind of untimely text called Cosmic Consciousness by Maurice Buck, which is a very popular book in the 1960s, written at the end of the 19th century, read by Steve Jobs many, many times. And it was written by a disciple of Walt Whitman's who had had a kind of epiphanic experience while reading some poetry of the Romantics aloud. Now, if you do this, if you take Allen Ginsberg's advice and go home and read Shelley's Adonai aloud, you may find that you induce something like what the transpersonal psychologist Stanislav Grof described as holotropic breathing. That when you're doing this work with your breath and with your attention, you almost, by definition, quiet what the neuroscientists call the default mode network, the I, me, mine network that is firing for most of us most of the time. So just even textually, the text of the Bible is itself already a fecund and rich source of psychedelic experience. Whereas, like, it's interesting, Terence McKenna made an interesting claim where he felt like, he went and studied with some masters and he decided that they were decadent and no longer in touch with living tradition because they no longer used the drugs. But there's a way in which we've got a purloined scripture, not just the KGV, obviously, the entirety of the perennial philosophy is there as textual resources for inducing non-ordinary states of consciousness with or without entheogenic support, right? We can look to the historical archive and we can look at theological movements like the Jesus freaks from the 60s and 70s, where people were doing precisely this, like the Rastas, using cannabis sacramentally in the context of reading scripture, okay? I don't think this is really on the menu and how we're thinking about medicalizing psychedelics. If it is, I'm happy, right? But if it's not, I want to gently suggest that it's not surprising that there was cannabis in this temple and that the Bible is always already psychedelic, also because there's other psychedelic content in the Bible itself, not just in this Solomon's temple, that if you look at the book of Genesis and you look at the interactions between Rebecca and Leah in the exchange of mandrake for the right to sleep with Jacob, you're going to see that there's a swap of drugs for sex hidden in plain sight in the Old Testament that in a longer talk I could defend as a smoking gun for Darwinian sexual selection and the role of psychedelics in the human toolkit, which we can talk more about in Q&A. But the point is that not even the Bible can really erase this role, this trace of psychedelics in our evolutionary heritage. And that if you look at the history of the commentary on it, people attempt to explain it away. But there are some fascinating, yes, contemporary psychonauts who, if you go on Arrowwood, have worked pretty seriously with mandrake, and it's no trifling matter. And what they report is precisely, that this would be a kind of shamanic intervention that Rebecca or Leah was making in the use of the mandrakes. It both functions intriguingly as an aphrodisiac, a kind of what we would call probably a dissociative like datura, but also as an abortifacient, that it was used to induce abortion way back I think well into the well, this is probably 5th century BC. So new shit has come to light is contemporary project I'm working on, which is just trying to bring out the Bible as context for set and setting, but also bring out the ambient psychedelic quality of the text itself. And again, I'd be happy to talk more about that in Q&A. And then before I turn to part three, but I also wanted to note before I turn into part three, because I've been going on like an awful lot, that my collaborator Trey Connor is also in the house tonight, and that we're working on these projects together. So maybe before I turn to number three, tune into the sacred as the necessary and sufficient condition for healing with ecodelics, where I really want to suggest exactly that if we want to really, for lack of a better word, potentiate the healing capacity of psychedelics in the current contemporary landscape of medicalization and venture capital, corporate capital, and so forth, we want to think first and foremost about set and setting, and that when we begin to think first and foremost about set and setting, we very quickly discover that there's very good reason why psychedelics were first scientifically legitimated through the study of the sacred, because it's through a study of the sacred that they're kind of non-falsifiability can be made evident. So I'll turn to that number three, but first I want to turn to my brother Trey Connor, because he's my collaborator in all things, and I know he's got something to chime in on that people are going to want to hear or not. Um, I don't want to give anything away, but Trey is such a mensch that he broke his tibia yesterday, but still wanted to drop in on the studio session. What's happening, Trey?
Uh, I'm hanging tough. I'm listening and enjoying and standing at the ready to chime in and improvise and collaborate as usual.
So
Uh,
when we're talking about the healing, it's not some metaphorical like pie in the sky kind of thing of Bob.
no, no, it's just the self-activated new shit has come to light mode that you're referring to. It's just making everything a sacrament, and that seems hard to do when you have a broken leg, but it actually is easier. A little shattering goes a long way um, towards the healing that you're discussing. And I think that it's interesting to note that these cadences and the the meter and rhythm of the KJV is in part what makes it so readily spliceable into this improvisatory body of work that exceeds a recording or a song or a performance. And I think that communal aspect of healing becomes available in a startling way, um,
Well, right. We can steal it and repeat it, right? And
again and again and
like
again.
Jesus, it's probably lesser known that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus plagiarizes from Psalms, right? He says only half joking, right? That the meek shall inherit the earth, which is a shocking statement, right? But maybe should be included in all set and setting uh, that is gentle enough in the contemporary landscape for psychedelics. Uh, that that it's those cadences, and you and I wrote a book together, Shut Up and Chant, and we know that it's already more than suggestive that even though meditation can be a hard road to travel for many people for various reasons, you can actually deactivate that default mode network that is the activation of what George Harrison called the I, me, mine all through the day, right? Uh, through simply shut up and chanting. For example, John 1:1, on archeon ho logos, kai ho logos, on proton
Logos.
theon, kai theos on ho logos. And like all you're doing, quote unquote, is blocking the usual BS and that
When
little
you
glimmer of truth will set you free.
when you block the blocker, you, who knows what's going to happen next? The surprise value. It sounds so boring if you're not doing it. Like,
Yeah,
well, I'll just block the blocker. That sounds kind of reductive and I, maybe even reactionary. No, no.
right. Really important.
It's
No,
a
really
courageous
important.
step. It's a
That
courageous step.
that default node network that is fine for all of us, which the research shows psilocybin decreases the activity of, I think for about 6 months. That
That's the afterglow.
yeah, akin to meditation. That dwindling of the default mode network is, ego just sounds like such a bummer. But
Yeah.
if you're just dialing down the default mode network, like you say, you're blocking the blocker. We're all getting in our own ways with that ego broadcast, and when we get in our own way, we're shooting ourselves in our foot. We're fill in the blank. We're stepping on our
Yeah.
capacities tremendously. And I think if you look back to this psychedelic archive in the 60s and 70s, that's what you see over and over again is people are realizing that they had an idea of themselves that was blocking who they could become, and that they needed to let go of that idea of themselves. And then when they did, something else happened.
And like you say, psilocybin in a low dose or a heroic dose, it has that integrative afterglow. And that's I think that's kind of how I think that we're riding along with this this endless scrolling dead text. Um, and it's the same thing with the ahamkara or the eye maker, the eye making. The map is not the territory, but I think that antakarana Sanskrit term for the inner instrument is a neat map for consciousness, so that it's easy to select for. Um, there's no harm, no foul. If you're in the eye making uh, cahoots space, that's no big deal because you can just spin that personal pan pizza of your consciousness and end
Right.
up right on over there in maybe a memory, a salient sort of almost or sensory input that activates something else that gets you out of it, that gets you out of that repetition and lets you embrace that I am that recursion aspect of yourself, right? So we have fun with that. And I think that this new course that we're charting, it's it's
I
it's
think it's a
it's
lot easier. Like the
it's
reason I'm happy to share it today, Nathan, is because you know I really think that we're through our kind of total absorption in the attention economy, through our repression of the psychedelic ecology, we've kind of stepped on our bandwidth so tremendously that simply uncorking some of that is going to be tremendously healing. And so, like, part three is just saying, tuning to the sacred is the necessary sufficient condition for healing with ecodelics, saying, like, look, um, there can be no one size fits all for psychedelics. I think it was Ram Dass that said, you trip alone, you die alone, or maybe it was Ben Franklin. But there's, it's only true up to a point. Obviously there's telepathy and other experiences as well. But there's this way in which we're called upon by the seriousness of the sort of existential question mark posed by psychedelics to take seriously the set and setting enough to stop and look with attention at the space in which we're going to experience them. And then when we do that, when we stop and focus attention on the space we're going to experience them, we begin to design, imagine, engineer, cajole, solicit, figure out, curate that space-time event that has to happen as part of the psychedelic journey. We're focusing our attention. And when we're focusing our attention, we're engaging in an act of radical reflection. How do I want this to go? Right? And when we begin to engage in that radical reflection, that is exactly the genesis of that lovely term psychedelic mind manifesting.
Mm,
You're dwindling the ego I and allowing the mind itself to manifest. Now, this is all, I think, even though that word sacred is a little scary, right? Like it's an anagram, right? For scared, right? And we do come with fear and trembling
that's
at
right.
times. Like we ought to recognize the sheer, I think in this medicalization, we shouldn't render it too saccharine. We should let people know uh, that they very well could be about to be looking into an abyss that looks back at them, right? To paraphrase Nietzsche, and that calls for a certain level of intent, and
Mm,
that maybe even just in the reclaiming of intent, there lies the sacred, right?
I love
Because
that.
so fascinated are we in the attention economy that simply reclaiming our own intent to observe how we want it to go for ourselves in meditation, in psychedelic experience, in chanting, uh, then we're already flexing, if you will, against this atrophy, this zombification of the outsourcing of all of our attention to the ravenous maw of the commodified spectacle machine, right? I mean, it if again, happy to hear other points of view on it, but that's the view from here. So I'd love to hear question and answer because we've gone about 45 minutes, which is I think the contract I signed with you, Nathan, wasn't it? Covenant, I
Oh
suppose it
yeah,
is.
the yeah, I need to check the fine print.
No,
No,
you can write a little psychedelic contract, like this is how it's going to go. Okay, like so. Thought we'd pause there, and thanks for chiming in, Trey.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm gonna turn off. You can tell I'm laying down. I apologize, but I'm apparently not allowed to move my leg for the foreseeable. So, but I'm gonna stay. I'm gonna stay listening. I'm gonna stay tuned in, everybody.
yeah, great hearing from both of you. I feel like there's about a billion different directions we could go in right now, which is the best. And we have until 7:30. We can use as much or as little of that time as
That's
feels natural. So,
perfect.
um, I have a question or two, but as another recent dead convert, it's kind of like a couple of things leaning in that direction. So I wanted to like get open up the floor basically and see who else has questions first. I I can get us started then.
Go, brother.
Yeah. Well, so it is definitely jumping back again because the Grateful Dead are one of my obsessions right now. But I was just thinking there seems maybe there's something here. I'm just wondering, uh, so like framing them as like these masters of set and setting, that's like perfect, I think. I was wondering how that might be related to their I'm kind of joking a bit
No, I
here, but
think it's there. I think I feel where you're going. Go.
yeah, their like relative inability to like record a proper studio album. So it seems like they have this issue with creating something like very crystallized. Um Also I don't know if I actually agree with that, but the critical consensus seems to be the studio albums aren't where the action is. So I'm just wondering if there's anything there that seems relevant to like this kind of like masters of this improvisational like live setting, like feedback with the audience or lack of there being an audience and performer division, but also this like getting the boys together in a room and getting them to like put down these crystallized tracks like I don't know if
Yeah,
that's a real
I'm
question,
gonna
but
let I'm gonna let Trey jump in on that because he's the musician in the duo here, and
mm-mm-mm.
I have a feeling. I mean, we play music together, but he's the musician.
Now, I object.
But point is, what do you think about that? Yeah, like slap forehead,
Well, look, yeah, the critical consensus on the studio albums, we've
Yes.
heard that, right? But that wasn't always the case. I think when they first started recording, well, by the time they got to their second effort in the studio, they were completely uh, ablaze with the idea of, especially, Phil Lesh's influence of his avant-garde training, and they were uh, taking the live recordings where everybody already had agreed, like this is where the X factor is, as it sometimes is called in dead communities. This is where the magic happens. This is where the sum is more than its parts, and so on and so forth. So when they made that recording, they took the live recordings and then I think worked with them, spliced the tapes, ran the tapes fast, ran the tapes slow, did all that kind of experimentation. So that's a neat bridge between the two worlds. But um,
And they're doing the
a
first
studio
16 track,
session
right?
is going to be unique, just like a performance is going to be unique. But a studio session does, I think, require a different kind of attention and a different kind of relationship to the technology and the way that those have to be, um,
Mastered.
played together. It's 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 I think it's astounding. It's what I think gets a lot of people into music. There is a fractal self that manifests there. The recursion of pressing pause, rewinding, listening again, trying that vocal take again. No, that wasn't good. Rewind, try it again. That kind of recursion is actually another psychedelic shortcut to the ego, the dwindling of the default mode network, however we want to phrase it, right?
Because you lose track
Whereas
of your
the
own
live
track.
experience does travel well into your ear holes, right? If you're these many years later, like you might be, Nathan, listening to a show from 1979 or the spring of 1990, maybe you're back before retirement and listening to that 73 style, whatever it is, those audience tapes sound amazing. They're saturated, they're already in relation and mixed to themselves. It's incredible. Whereas the studio performances, I think we're getting involved in what we've maybe noticed in our discussion of cannabis today, right? There's the for-profit thing is so foregrounded. They have to do this for the record company. They have to do this to maintain their lifestyle. It's a day job, right? So I think that that's an interesting observation. And I think we're all musicians, so that's why I pushed back on Rich because he's my main music buddy, so I don't like hearing those words coming out of his mouth. But I feel that way about all of us. I think that's a fun way to interact with family and friends and students, and opens up that musical self, which is precisely nonverbal and therefore perhaps um, more potent than words can be in an information ecology like we live in, this info quake, as Rich has said, like that we live in, right? It's I think it might be easier just to sort of easy skank your way into a show with a bunch of people around you and notice how good you feel from the inside out than it is to analyze a studio recording and realize, like, yeah, they're not the best singers on earth, sure. I don't know. That's some answer.
So,
Maybe someone wants to take it further. That's just an impression. Thanks
no,
for
but it's
asking
also
this.
part of the DIY part of that psychonaut word that you have in the title of this organization, which has a long history of being amateur in the best sense,
In the
uh,
best sense.
uh, DIY, right? And so the fact that you're relying on taper culture that you kind of reverse with the dead, that in fact it's the tapes that are the thing, and the studio albums are artifacts, right? Like, and so I'm just repeating some of what Trey is saying, but I think it's very interesting because it also distributes the authority. Part of the problem, I think, in contemporary psychedelics is like, which came out in the MDMA study, I think, of MAPS, is like,
Yeah.
who has the authority to adjudicate these sessions, right?
Yes.
And so part of I think the hack has to be that it's a distributed authority, right? That, as Trey
Love
and
it.
I are writing about in terms of the track Playing in the Band by Grateful Dead, right? Which is that, like, you have this taper culture is no accident, because the collective festival musical event that is occurring is a product of that collective consciousness that everyone is participating you know, in the collective. And so I think it really deconstructs, if you'll excuse the word, that kind of like binary that you were looking at there between the performer and and the audience, in a way that maybe Brecht didn't really anticipate, and which like isn't simply Dionysian, but allows for some kind of larger scale collective, similar to like a termite mound, right? They build this beautiful order out of just very simple things, in this case, very simple beats. So that's cool. You got another dead question, or?
I'm forming. I mean, I do think it's interesting. I'm just kind of bouncing around a few ideas that you guys were talking about. It is kind of interesting how with that second album that Trey was mentioning, I think that's Anthem of the Sun, right?
Right.
Uh and there was like almost this hybrid of like, let's take these live recordings and recontextualize them and remix them, and then but also on the other side of it, and again, I'm just kind of getting into them in the past year, so I may be mistaken, but Europe 72, which was like one of their best selling records, or like live records. I heard also that they went back and did a lot of overdubs to that. And so there's kind of this like several albums of theirs that are like neither fully live
Live
or
slash dead.
fully studio albums.
Live
Well,
Yeah.
that's a
slash dead.
that's a good listening experiment for you, Nathan, because we all became familiar with the record when it came out, and that was a smart move. They had a lot of new songs, a lot of new Hunter Garcia material in particular, and rather than going to the studio, let's repeat the live dead bit, but let's take it on the road. We're going to Europe anyway. And so they brought a mobile recording studio, recorded it properly, 16 tracks and the whole bit, right? Um, but yeah, not only did they go back and do overdubs, they went back and removed some of Pigpen's organ playing because it was not quite as sexy with it in there. It was too funky and crazy, right? Isn't that funny, right? So, but this is the listening experiment for you, because you can listen to the way that Live Europe was curated. I think it sounds, it had there's some effervescence that I don't get from it compared to when I listened to when they released the whole kit and caboodle, in which they
Mhm.
did, I think about 10 or 15 years ago, they put every single performance that they'd recorded, and they didn't mess around with overdubs, and they didn't take out any of Pigpen's genius, right? And those shows are properly heard, I think, like that. The whole show, as it unfurled, as the moment as they danced it together, the audience and the performers, the whole composer, listener, performer kind of rhetorical triangle of music that was, I guess, shattered well before the Dead came along. But they're pushing that further, right? You'll love it. You'll listen to a show, and then you'll want to listen to the show from the next night. Similar set list, different experience. So that's your reward for enjoying Europe 72, is that you won't probably ever listen to that recording again.
And part of the come on of the book is, what else are we going to do after the AI has sucked up everything and given us a very basic stipend? We're going to have to cue set and setting with Grateful Dead. I'm only half kidding, but I see Michael Garfield has got his camera on.
Yeah, trying to wrangle this question down into communicable dimensionality here.
Oh, don't ruin it
Uh,
that
No,
way.
don't do that.
like in thinking about live versus studio, in thinking about the decision to focus on King James,
Mm,
and how that is also something that demonstrates a lot more curatorial and authorial intent
Mm.
and yet in this other way, uh, reveals a sort of like taper mentality of like these are the things worth sharing.
Mm.
Yes.
I want to draw a connection to the distinction between theater and film, and
Hmm.
then what all of this tells us, thinking about this stuff and the trade-offs involved in thinking about, like, I'm a little bit repelled. You bring up the MDMA research. I'm repelled by the efforts to design consciousness,
Of course.
right?
Anybody,
And
anybody, anybody who notices it is repelled.
uh,
Yeah, it's not fun when the trip master shows up and tells you how it is and how it's going to be, right? So I understand that.
yeah, so like I guess like part of the question is to the point that you just made, Rich, is one about like uh what are the sort of quasi strategies for like preserving this kind of thing in a world where like the the technologies of attention and like the design of consciousness are starting to play such a big part. Like, like I look around and it's like, you know uh, Burning Man has like a DoD and Silicon Valley DNA now. Even the dead, it's
Oh,
like
always
not.
already, my brother. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just don't. It's interesting that, like, one of the major distinctions between theater and film uh is the audience. I think about your line in Darwin's Pharmacy about, like, you don't really ever extract a drug, you just sort of re-territorialize it from one system to another
That's
system.
Younger. Yeah.
And so, yeah, so the like the process of studio production or the process of film production can continue to involve this like distributed termite mound thing over time. uh but it also involves like a lot of cuts. And
Mostly cuts.
yeah, so I don't know where I'm taking this, but it's just like,
Here's
yeah.
let me take you to Saint Stephen, who's a real cut, right? So we're treating Saint Stephen as the key to understanding the dead's appropriation of KJV for set and setting. So why is Stephen killed? Since you talked about that cut, right, and this intention that, for lack of a better way of putting it, from a certain point of view, you've got an awful lot of the Bible, and then Jesus shows up and compresses it real small. He remixes the meek shall inherit the earth from Psalms 37:11, and he puts it into the Sermon on the Mount, and you've got a kind of hyper compressed file that doesn't require Leviticus or Moses in order to decode it, right? And now, and it goes off like an info bomb, right? And uh, necessitates, you know, the killing of Jesus, right? So they kill, that threatens the monopoly of the media class, right? So you got to deplatform the dude. So he gets deplatformed. And then St. Stephen comes along, and this is why I'm bringing up St. Stephen. St. Stephen comes along and says, hey, I'm going to take all of the Bible, including the New Testament, I'm going to compress it into a 56 verse oration that I'm going to drop on your skulls, right? And it throws the crowd into a murderous, gnashing rage. And he's the first martyr, right? So, of the New Testament, besides, of course, John the Baptist and Jesus. And of course, this is the dead song that I think holds the key to understanding their understanding of the Bible, which is the Bible demands that we compress it. In other words, and
Mm.
it demands that we make cuts, that we cut bits out. That's why these cadences are important, because you can pull things out, like the meek shall inherit the earth. And in that demand to be cut, then we're really engaging in a kind of like self-sacrifice, right? In other words, because we're coming up against the fact that there's no way we can master this entire data set of this biblical text and all of the commentary ensuing from it. We have to sort of kind of give our best remix and let go, if that makes sense. It's like trying to surf a tsunami. So the cuts are conducive. The cuts are the thing, right? That if we're asking people not to have consciousness designed for them, but for them to participate in the curation and cultivation and articulation of their set and setting, then they're kind of thrown, in this Heidegger word, Geworfenheit. They're thrown. They're like, whoa, like, what am I going to use? I'm just like, take this, kid. Check out Psalms. You know, it was good enough for Kerouac, man. Like that. There's some stuff you can pick up off the shelf and say, okay, I'm going to begin to gently design my own set and setting, and that's going to involve sacrifice, right? That's going to be doing this and not that. Does that make sense? And so this is amazing because something it took me a long time to figure out, but in Kant, the great German philosopher, like aesthetic judgments have this quality of necessity, meaning that you can't avoid making them. So therefore, they're not up to your ego to decide what you like and don't like, how you want the set and setting to go, and so forth. So what I'm suggesting is that really the necessary and sufficient condition for what we're looking for from the healing is that kind of radical reflection, and that psychedelics can be, what the Buddhist tradition calls upaya, skillful means for working on that reflection, but that they themselves are neither necessary nor sufficient. What's necessary and sufficient is this sense of radical intent, and that radical intent requires cutting off a lot of that media that you're talking about, right? Because you're saying, okay, what are my inputs and outputs? What's my inventory? Does that make sense? Am I addressing your question wrestled out of the chaos like Jacob with the angels?
Yeah, I might go back and listen to this twice and then appropriate it for my purposes.
Like, boom, right? Exactly. Is that we're being introduced to that creative faculty that we have in our own consciousness. This is why the word designing consciousness, engineering consciousness, none of those really work. That's like nailing Jello to the wall, right? But being involved in the creative awareness of our own consciousness, that's doable, right? Uh, and when we do that with any serious intent, I would hazard to guess, and would love to hear somebody concur, suggest otherwise, or whatnot, that we're in fact doing the work of the sacred, because the work of the sacred, Eliade is not fashionable now, but it's very helpful to look at how he treats the sacred as, these techniques for stepping out of ordinary time, right? And that even chanting itself, because of its interruption of linear thought, allows us to sort of dissolve out of ordinary time, because there's no one thing after another. There's just, trucking, right? Like there's just, you keep going. Uh, so my sense is that if we smack our forces and say, oh, like slight reframe, as the psychologists say, that the Grateful Dead were creating spiritual contexts of enormous cultural and even downright evolutionary influence. And, we need not begin to trace out the lineages between Silicon Valley and the Dead. And so
No.
it's right. It's like, it's not all beautiful what comes out of it, but what we're trying to do is make available aspects of the past that in a ways have been purloined, right? That there are still these ways in which the dead can be potentiated. And that's why I'm happy to talk as a relatively recent convert, because I used to say, I was like, oh, I'm the only person who's ever written a book on psychedelics and hates the Grateful Dead, you know? Because when I came of age, what I thought the dead were, I was wrong, but what I thought the dead were was the sort of, I don't know, the sort of prep school kids that I knew as an undergraduate studying with the Jesuits at Georgetown, who were like, driving their sobs and showing up to dead shows and playing hacky sack and so forth. And that just wasn't me, like, and I much more identified with the verve and experimentation of punk and post-punk, and thought that like that was done, that like here was this kind of archaic vestige of hippie culture, which like I had nothing against and was an enthusiastic, uh, learner of lysergic acid, at the time. But the Grateful Dead just struck me as dead. But it was only later, and I might say in the context of cannabis, that I kind of really realized what kind of like obvious genius is going on there. Because like you, I heard, oh, they're not really very good singers,
Right.
like that moment. And I'm just like, okay, that's not really what it's about, you know?
Mm-mm.
And so
And then as it
that
turns out,
and
they
that
are.
opens up a big seam, right? Which I want you to jump in on, Trey, but that opens up a big seam because one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk to however many people wanted to show up and ever listen to it is because if we've got like 35 million people more or less using cannabis on a daily basis in the United States under kind of legal or medical set and setting, then we have this incredible capacity that I think is really not being tapped. I mean, maybe I'm not giving people enough credit, but for the most part, I think people have a subject object relationship to weed, and it's the weed that is the thing. And they're not focusing on set and setting or sacramental use as anything serious, or like maybe they stumble upon it, like I did. But there's a vast healing capacity abroad, as it were, where people can get slightly better at working with cannabis as a medicine, and it's going to yield even better effects than it already yields. So that's just about ambient improvement, ambient healing that can be had simply by saying, hey, like the dead were adepts of set and setting. Now we got something here. Oh, from Michael. Okay. Oh yeah, I don't know this piece, but I'll check it out. Um, so, but I do think that the medium is remix is the message, right? In other words, why is Saint Stephen killed? Because he remixed the Bible into 56 verses. Why is Jesus killed? Because he remixes the Bible, into the Gospels, and and challenges the standing of the monopolistic legal community that was interpreting the law, along with John the Baptist. So
Mm.
he's Stephen is a taper. In other words, like
Mm-hmm.
he's repeating a show that he has received, and he's transmitting it, and that threatens the intellectual property, right, model of the scribes and the Pharisees. So there's much to be learned there from the contemporary moment. And I think, I don't know if you were here in the beginning, Michael, when I was saying like maybe we're at this historical moment where there's a kind of psychedelic plateau has happened due to a number of factors, and that we can like have the opportunity to just have the venture capitalists and the universities and the think tanks and so forth all stemp gently away from psychedelics and leave them alone and allow us to grow them in our closets and listen to the Grateful Dead, because it was already working. And that there is no psychedelic renaissance, right?
That's
Because
some
I
good
mean,
upaya.
sorry.
That's some good upaya.
Yeah. And so I'm proudly transmitting here from Penn State, which is the first place on the planet to mass cultivate psilocybin, psilocybe cubensis, when it was brought here by the CIA in 1959 to Dr. Ralph Meebone, who was a mycologist here, and grew, I think, 10,000 grams of psilocybin for the paltry sum of $500. So, you know, Penn State's never been out in front on how to maximize its intellectual property. So, but I feel like this is an event of planetary significance, to be honest, that the mass cultivation of psilocybin may well yet allow us to snatch joy from the maw of transhumanist doom. Because I do. So, Michael, what do you think of that? That there's this historical moment where maybe people will leave psychedelics alone for a while.
I'm not hopeful
Hmm.
for
It's too
that
hard to
in
make money on
particular,
them, man.
but I do bet on there being. Hold on, you guys need to leave.
Take a step
But
back.
but like at the same time, there it's these communities, I think, become like an eradicable remainder.
Yeah,
It's
self-replicating residues.
yeah, like it's not really like it doesn't matter if Brian Johnson is like publicly recording his 5 gram trips, getting nothing out of it, and then decides to like commercialize this for longevity.
I really
You
don't think
know,
so. I actually don't think it matters. Like,
yeah,
like Psalms 37, fret not of the doings of evildoers. It's like later Jesus will say, they shall have their reward. It's like, it's a self-negating enterprise. Like, I mean, I really think because, and again, happy to be challenged on this, but because of the essentially constitutive quality of set and setting, that the corporate model can't figure out how to nail that jello to the wall, right? And
Right.
that in order to really get at psychedelics, maybe you really do need to grow those mushrooms yourself, Michael, right? That I've gotten more than one report from people who've eaten commercially grown mushrooms that are like, oh my God, like I spent 5 hours and the mushrooms are telling me that they don't like how they were grown. I'm not making that up. Set and setting, maybe, but easily fixed, right? Grow them in your own closet in New Mexico. It's legal to do it there.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I just think the initial gush and, people falling all over themselves in order to spend more money on psychedelics and how it was going to be the magic bullet for all mental health issues and so on and so forth. I mean, it's crested, hasn't it?
I don't know if it's crested, but I do think, and I thank you for asking. Like I do think that the problem is more like one of being able to facilitate, like there being a topsoil in which these things can happen. You know that they're
You are
they're
that
they're
topsoil, no?
they're continuing to be in underground, and like
Sure.
yeah,
No, I agree with that. But as you said, there's this I don't know what you call it, but the remainder, it's not going to go away. It didn't go away under the total prohibition of 1966 to, well, the present moment for LSD. It didn't go away. So uh, and this is the way it's always propagated itself, I would suggest, along with other mystical practices that always take shelter in these small scale communities. And that's a feature and not a bug, I would say, which is not meaning I say, oh, like, psychedelics are not for the masses. Absolutely not. They're for everybody to grow in their own closet. They just don't need to, you know, buy into some over-determination of set and setting by the medical context and saying, okay, it's going to be okay because I'm going to go and trip in a scientific setting. And then it doesn't work out. You're like, oh, I'm still experiencing ontological shock. No, much better to be fully transparent, open source. It's just the argument that I wrote with Trey and Dark Side of the Shroom, that like fulfill the legacy of Bob Wallace. Make the information available, right? Make the positive but not sugar-coated treatment of what this path entails available, right? And so the problem there is there's so much bad information out there in terms of this kind of spectacular display that you're talking about with Brian Johnson, right? That people think that that's what it is, right? That's what psychedelics are, right? Just as I thought that I knew what the Grateful Dead was, right? But good news is here's, 8 of us at least, collectively participating, having the conversation, which is, I think, also an aspect of psychedelic culture where, you get together and you reason. Come, let us reason together. Isaiah,
Mm.
that, and we discuss and we're like, wow, like, what is the meaning of these experiences? How have they manifested in my life? How do I integrate them into my life in a way that helps me and the people around me to thrive? Because I never suggested that psychedelics entered the evolutionary toolkit to do anything but that. They're tools for thrivation, but they're hidden from us. They're repressed. They're in the case of cannabis, endlessly misunderstood and badmouthed. So, vouchsafed, I think, as the biblical tradition says it,
Mm.
naysaying, uh, bearing false witness. How much false witness has been borne against psychedelics and even cannabis in particular, So, but it's okay because we're still here. It still heals. The knowledge is still available. Uh, and I think, totally compatible with a psychiatric, psychological, medicalized framework that gives space to the client, patient, subject, participant to be more than co-author of the experience, right? But that's already an enormous hack on the ordinary medical way of things, where drugs are administered, right? No, there should be no administering of psychedelics. That's, prima facie unethical, right? That
Absolutely.
psychedelics are part of a recursive, self-transformational practice that is very old that you're plugging into when you engage in it. And nobody's an expert in it. So nobody
Mm.
should be certified as being an expert in it because that's a false narrative. Like a Taino shaman that I know who's, I'm sure, journeyed nearly as much as Alexander Shulgin, which nobody probably in the history of the planet has ever exceeded the sheer variety of psychedelic experience of that man and his group. Uh, that uh, he said he said to me, because I said, oh, like my primary relationship to psychedelics is being humbled by them, right?
Yeah.
and and that includes to the discussion of them, right? That, like, this idea that I would sort of model them or theorize them. All I'm attempting to do is make some aspects of the experiences that they open up for us all shareable. That's all.
Yeah.
Um, and he said to me, anybody who thinks they're an expert just isn't, you know. And it's close to the Richard Feynman quote, anybody who thinks they understand quantum mechanics doesn't, right? And so I think that's a good way to keep it sacred,
Yeah.
is that no expertise here. just care, kindness, guidance, experience. Experience, yes, recognizing that some people have more practice than others, but that doesn't mean they know it all. So anyway, that's why I like that word psychonaut, Nathan. I believe we could visit the etymology of it. I think it comes from Ernst Jünger, uh, and his massive text, originally titled Rauschen, is now apparently available on Internet Archive in English, translated, which is really cool.
Mm.
So you can go there. He was a remarkable thinker and writer, and probably took LSD with Martin Heidegger. And certainly, um, explored the domains in an interesting way, and a place worthy of a psychonaut. And a psychonaut is an interesting treatment of set and setting, right? It bears a certain responsibility. Like, I am myself the explorer of my psyche. Of course, another word for that is contemplative, right?
Hmm.
Or mystic. But not without coincidence, this is, seemed to be part of the veritable etiology of psychedelics, at least in the 60s and 70s. It'll be interesting. We'll see if that historical moment has passed, but it hasn't passed for me.
Mm.
This is jumping back for a second, and it's kind of a technical question, I guess, but it got stuck on my mind. Because I think based on discussions I've had lately, it is kind of on everyone's mind if like the wave of the Renaissance or whatever has crested or not. And it's so hard to tell because we're just like in the middle of it, and how do you really gauge that? But I was thinking like, has there been like a jump the shark moment of like the Renaissance? Like, has there been
Let's
something that
hope so.
was so outrageous that it was like, so I was trying to think of what that would be,
Well,
and I didn't know if you guys had thoughts on that.
I think Michael already has a nomination.
Mm. Oh yeah, yeah, right.
No, I don't. I don't pay close enough attention to know when the shark was jumped, but I do feel like it was always already jumped. Like, there were some particular venture capitalists that I saw that were swarming around the term ibogaine, that I was just like, okay, I see it, like, this is, I see how this is going to go down, and I don't even need to fill in the blanks. Um,
Mhm.
so, uh, and I didn't think it was going to work, to be honest with you, because I thought there was going to be an attempted, as Michael said earlier, territorialization of psychedelics. That's it, right? Exactly. Um, so, and it's interesting because MAPS was always already a drug company. That was explicit from the very beginning.
Yeah.
They were scapegoating Leary from the outset in
Mm.
order to rebrand themselves. And so when people are scapegoating in order to rebrand themselves, it's already in the bag, right? You're
Yeah.
already not coming with humility. You're not coming, and lots of great stuff got done nonetheless. But that tendency was already there, and like, we just wonder if it's just not more productive to just cultivate a DIY community driven culture. I like what some people are doing out there with decriminalized nature and so forth, creating kind of workshops for set and setting, but most of it just has to be underground, and it's going to be interesting to see if in this cresting, as we're discussing it, if the religious institutions sort of step up and say, well, actually, we're still interested. We're interested in this Houston Smith lineage. We're interested, in psychedelics and spirituality. And and I would hope they would say the following thing: while we don't think we deserve exclusive custodianship of psychedelics in this culture, we are willing to wade in and wonder, what role these can play in some kind of a spiritual renaissance that I would applaud, you know. where all the diverse threads of the perennial philosophy are brought to bear in ways that are healing in the everyday life of people, and not simply to propagate institutional, imperatives and whatnot. So, and for the rest of us too, for the rest of us who are not members of any institutionalized religion, how do we help, reenact the Good Friday experiment, and benefit from psilocybin occasioning mystical experiences of meaningful and long-lasting significance, as I believe the title of the Johns Hopkins University study was titled way back there in the early aughts. Because that, nobody's arguing with that, right? That hasn't crested. That was repeating the 1962, was it 62 Marsh Chapel? That's repeating the Leary, Alpert, and Messner. I think Messner was in on that. And Walter Pahnke, the theorist of ego death, the psychologist of ego death, the theologian of ego death, is reenacting that. And that's what bootstrapped the whole remedicalization. That's what gave them legitimacy, that they had this indubitable quality that psilocybin can occasion meaningful mystical experiences of meaningful, long-lasting significance. That's big. That is very, very big. Now, it's hard to figure out the bridge language to deal with that theologically in a lot of traditions. But I think that the solution to that is for people to eat the mushrooms themselves, or smoke the cannabis themselves, or take the LSD themselves, and see, as Huxley did, that like, oh, I've read about all of this and here it is. Or Houston Smith did. I've read about all this and here it is. And then do that work of exegesis and interpretation and integration into the theology of any sect and institution open enough to engage this. But I think most of those institutions would acknowledge that the spiritual crisis is acute enough that they might agree with the Tibetan Buddhists, let it all out.
Yeah.
Let all the Dharma out because the people need it, right? And there's no time to stand on ceremony, but there is time for kindness and care and, wise and wisdom, right? And not just taking 5 grams of psilocybin cubensis and eating it and videoing yourself and wondering how many erections you get or whatever he did. It's just, isn't that what he does? Isn't he the quantifier of erections? I think his girlfriend should be the quantifier of his erections, or whoever. Okay? Like, serious eye roll, right? I have students who are influenced, So what are you going to do? Fret not, the evildoers, for they cannot crowd out the legitimate psychedelic experience. Did that answer your question a little bit, Nathan?
Yeah, definitely. And I think yeah, this whole conversation has been great, like so many different directions.
Well, we can stop or we can keep opening doors, but I mean, I do think that we should be joyful because, like, I think a lot of times if people are talking about this in your context, maybe they're feeling like the cresting thing is like a bad thing. Like it's great that University of Ottawa is supporting, something with the word psychonaut in it. That's wonderful. It's great that Emory has the Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality, and so on, right? It's great that Hopkins has that. But the Cheek and Jowl working with the science side and the intellectual property side is unseemly, and always unseemly in a university context. But guess that's what a university is.
Yeah.
and but more importantly, it's going to squelch the healing possibilities of these beautiful allies, unless the door is opened to that last necessary and sufficient condition, the sacred, and seeing the sacred as compatible with the medical. what Trey and I wrote with Nishay about in Dark Side of the Shroom, it's like, I think we called it the 3 card Monty of the bait and switch, where, psychedelics were legitimized again using the, sacred experience, spiritual experience, and then quickly kind of like, rolled into a, productivity tool slash, medical treatment, for everything that ails us, to the likes of, oh, well, I won't use any names, but, point is that there was a rapid march towards commodification and pending and so forth. That, I think that's only a good thing if that slows. And then if something like what you're up to there in Ottawa, Nathan, is like, okay, and we're still here now because people are still going to be doing these studies, but also, even more importantly, I don't think the wave of decriminalization has crested.
Mm,
And I think that's a much more important wave than the research wave, the legitimation wave. Um, that
definitely.
And it's very important for set and setting. It's, a no-brainer that, you know it's harder to eat your mushrooms in a carceral, society, in a context where that is treated as an inquisitorial, uh, crime, right? It's a
Hmm.
it's a thought crime. Um, so, um, that, I think that means that we have a really beautiful moment where some of the legitimacy narrative still remains, that nobody quite has the energy to want to scapegoat them again, but also the kind of commodification and sort of slathering after the medical appropriation of it is humbled a little bit. And maybe people who are in the therapeutic clinical context, they learn to work with what people are already doing on their own, right? That you manage the liability that way, that you offer your services, in the context of broader therapeutic context that hopefully is supported by insurance. Probably a better deal. Is any psychedelic therapy supported currently by insurance in Canada? I'm guessing it is.
Not yet.
Really?
Or like read
Even like addiction
hold-
therapy?
There was in Quebec specifically, there
right,
was
right.
a few first, yeah, quote unquote legal ones that weren't part of a trial or anything, but a private practice. But that was 2 years
5 years ago.
ago, and I haven't, yeah, 2 or 3 years ago, and I haven't heard anything since then, honestly.
Mm,
Well, I would love to hear more because I used to have a connection on that, like in terms of understanding how it was going, but it was all going stock market and things like that. The venture, it was trading like the people were trading penny stocks on, like, ibogaine companies and so forth, in Canada, if I remember correctly. Um, and maybe I don't, but those tools ought to be out there. The opiate epidemic hasn't gone away. I mean, uh,
mm,
but this this kind of steamrolling perspective that probably you heard about from Nishay in more
Mhm.
detail, and, yeah, insight, that, it's not the way, right? I mean, this is why I think it's more like, and not every, but like many great Dead shows, as you now know, Nathan and I have learned, there's that moment where they say, take a step back, right? And we cued that in the Dark Side of the Shroom piece, because this is a beautiful moment where you can take that step back and just be like, okay, like, we're no longer in the massive criminalization, but you're not reading in the New York Times every freaking day, about how it's the hottest new thing. So now where
Mhm.
are we at? Um, and to me, it reminds me a lot of like other tech rollouts, right? It's like every few years, virtual reality is going to be the next big thing, right?
Right.
Right. So Michael
And
has more
it
to say on that.
it is true. I guess it is, yeah, it's a nice moment to like you said, kind of like stand back and it's like the cat's back out of the bag and it's gonna be harder to put it back in because initially it was like no one knew what the hell any of this was. But now that it's, I mean, been
And there's a
dormant.
literature. There's a literature now
Yeah.
that you kind of can't go back from, you
Yeah.
know?
So I think the conversations like these are cause for optimism too. Yeah, if one of the benefits of the wave was that we can have this conversation on Zoom in kind of a university
Yes,
sponsored
exactly.
setting, then that's great.
Yeah, and think about how good that optimism is, if you will, for set and setting, right?
Hmm.
That we need that we don't like. This is why, I'm like, it's, Dark Side of the Shroom is a jokey title because it can't all be dark side, right? It's like there's some technicolor in there too, that that it's just that, just because Daddy says it's okay now to use psychedelics doesn't mean that the set and setting is the most conducive to the kind of healing that we all know can emerge from their sacramental and festive and intentional use.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm not clued in enough to the contemporary discourse to see if this language of the sacred is really making it into the set and setting discourse, except insofar as everything seems to be getting, as happens in academia, wrapped inside of the same old jargons, right? So, like, I'm reader on different manuscripts where, like, man, every different scholarly mill is cranking its way through psychedelic stuff, and some of it, again, like, borderline unethical, I think, because of its, to be honest, because of the lack of first person experience. And therefore there's the lack of humility and gratitude that would come with more first person experience. It's, like, it used to be people would write books and they couldn't really talk about their own experience, and then it became okay to talk about their own experience, but now they talk about their own experience and it's clear that it's not really very substantial, if that makes sense, like the Brian Johnson episode. But yeah, if all the psychedelic renaissance did is that we can have this conversation on Zoom, that is cool. I believe it was fashionable, Michael, to say we are the ones we have been waiting for a few years ago. Uh, and what I think we can really say as a remix there is that just like the psychedelic conversation continues, and that that
If-
the truth is in the remix,
Hmm.
and the
right?
remix is up to you, right? That's
The
the
remix is the medium, is the message, right?
like I love when a moment ago when you said, "Oh, Big Daddy says it's okay to do psychedelics." That does not set the set and setting.
No, it does not,
It
right?
does not. So I think that all of the desacralization that we were just recalling and lamenting certainly was symptomatic of those this will to control, the institutionalized will to stratify and control. And it's just so funny how it's like it is hidden in plain sight. It's like entheogens are the teacher, are the storyteller, and offering inspiration, not imposing a specific message. And so that's what I think part of why we're so attracted to the empowering the listener, or so to speak, the first person, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a very Terrapin Station moment. Then, if humility can be found by looking back at the literature, it's no shame to have got caught up in a wave. We've all
No.
surfed tech waves and stuff. There, but looking back upon the literature, some humility could be found. It's sort of like then they can get to that Terrapin Station vibe. It's our job is the quarry is not to master, but to shed light, if anything, right? That's the
Shed
dead
light
vibe I'm feeling.
and to slough off old self.
Yes. That's how you shed light. You slough off the old self.
Yeah. Um, and, just again, something Niche taught us, full disclosure to people on like what it really means to consent to that kind of experience, right? What
Mm.
you're consenting it to do in that kind of experience is consenting to an existential gambit, a experiment on the self with the self that, if you're lucky, won't leave the self intact. And so I don't know how you do liability limitation on that. Right? I mean, you're like, hey, my old self is gone. Like, can you put it back? Honestly, there was a really interesting character here at Penn State, Rustum Roy. He helped found the Science, Technology, and Society program here, which is the oldest such program until it was terminated in 2011. And it was just what it sounds like, interdisciplinary study of all these threads of human culture. And he was also a materials scientist. Um,
Mm.
and friends, strangely, with Andrew Weil. Why am I invoking Rustum Roy, though?
Because he was in STS, and that was the medical humanities protean version. No,
Uh,
some. Oh
there's no
well.
shame in dropping the thread. I dropped the thread. Maybe it's time to turn off, tune in, and drink a beer. So, so, the bar drops the thread and the scroll is dropped.
Over and
But
out.
yeah, over for now. Um, but it
Well,
really was good fun. And I hope we at least kind of like modeled like how much good fun we should have in psychedelic dialogue, because that's what we tried to model here. And that this is really a big part of, what we hear about a lot, the integrative work, right? The integrative work involves that kind of like dialectical refutation of our own fixed ideas, right?
Yeah.
And so in discussion, we see sometimes how silly our own attachments are, and we can let them go a little bit easier, hopefully.
absolutely. Yeah, definitely. It's like losing my old attachment to not getting the dead.
Exactly. I'm just like, yep, I was
So,
dumb.
yeah. But this has been fantastic. Thank you to everyone, Michael, Trey, Reed, Ariel. This has been a really fun night. So and thank you, Richard, for joining us. We're looking forward to seeing what all
Further,
of you are going to be up to, all of us.
yeah, exactly. Further,
Thanks.
further collaborations / conspiracies. And I firmly believe that any divide between this kind of psychonautical, first person experience driven, and the sort of clinical medical aspect, it's not a divide, right?
Mm,
That any of those divisions were a product of that kind of first wave of the need to feel legitimate. Like Maps felt like it needed to sacrifice Timothy Leary in order to be credible, right?
To be credible,
But
to
now,
show rigor. Yeah.
yes, but now we can kind of muddle through for a while and say,
Yeah.
well, I don't know, I'm just thinking maybe there's some unpotentiated human potential of cannabis by partnering with meditation. I don't know, right? And, then going from there, instead of like, this is going to be the thing that utterly transforms you and makes us all live forever in uploaded versions of ourselves that are just tripping, right? I mean, isn't that the zeitgeist moment, right? Like
Yeah.
the agental AI tripping as you, right? I don't really have time to trip. Like let my AI agent trip for me and then report back.
It's like the sun is up now. We can stop looking at past lives in the dirt and go home. Or no, AI wants to keep going. Okay. Wow.
Good. Well, thanks to everybody. Really appreciate the
Yeah.
opportunity. Let's chat again anytime. Michael, so good to see you again, brother. And Trey, should we all chant together and like just command you to stand and heal and walk again, or
Yeah, let me aim the phone at it there.
oh yes, brother. Yeah.
But
Well,
yes, I will receive these chants. They're
We're
well
all
received.
sending best healing
yep.
vibes.
The tone and the intentionality, I feel it.
Good.
Really nice to meet you, Nathan and Reed, and see you again, Michael, and everyone else. And Rich Vaughn, I'll see you soon. All right, that was awesome. Thank you,
Yeah,
everybody.
this was super fun. See all of you hopefully very
Thank you.
soon. Yeah. Bye.